listening to part 19 of our 24-part series, Marvelous Mints, The Wise Woman Way, with Susan Wade at Time Monk Radio. Hello, Susan. Welcome back to Time Monk Radio.
Thank you so much, Gemini. I've really enjoyed the past 2 weeks where we got to actually talk about mints. After months and months of talking about the mint family, we finally got to the mints themselves. And this week, we're going to focus in on another wildly popular plant, not a mensa, not in the mensa genus, but in the Ocimum genus. Ocimum is basil. Basil. Many people are astonished to learn that basil is in the mint family. And this is primarily because people don't let basil flower. If you've ever grown basil, you know that the tastiest leaves are the basil leaves that grow before the plant flowers. And so most basil growers pinch off the tops of their basil plants, and they keep pinching. Every stalk that comes up in the basil, they pinch. And to pinch, it's just exactly what it sounds like. You just take your thumb and your forefinger. You can use your nails, or you can even use a little pair of scissors if you want to, and you pinch or nip off that little growing bit at the top. And what happens is very common in the mint family, and in fact in many plants, and that is that plants are adapted to be browsed. So it's not just human beings that are out there nipping the plants. Deer and elk and moose and goats and all kinds of other animals nip at the plants as well. And so many plants, and especially plants in the mint family, have special hormones that are produced at the leaf nodes, and that's where the leaf meets the main stalk of the plant. And there's a hormone that's produced there when the top of the plant is bitten off. And that hormone causes two new tops to grow, whereas before there was a stalk coming up, and then we cut that stalk off. Where the leaves join that stalk, from those places, a new stalk grows. Do you grow basil, Gemini?
I do. I grow a couple different kinds.
And do you see that happening?
Yes, it does. It wants to fork out in different directions, yes.
Exactly. Wherever we pinch it or nip it off, then it's going to fork. Two are going to grow. Next week we're going to be talking about oregano and marjoram. And I have a big patch of wild oregano, and I take my students out there early in the summer, and I say, start harvesting so I'll get twice as much next month.
Right.
Nip, 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 nip. Of course, one of the other things that we're doing with the basil is that we are sexually frustrating the basil. Now, it's not as much sexual frustration as, say, a marijuana plant suffers, right? Because marijuana has male plants and female plants, and we just completely eliminate the male plants and just let the poor female marijuana plants, they're producing lots and lots of resin because they're hoping for some pollen. But the basil is a self-fertile flower. It's a male and female in the same flower. So we're sexually frustrating it simply by not allowing it to flower. And what usually happens when all is said and done with your basil? It figures out a way to flower, doesn't it?
It does.
It does. It says, I see what's going on here. They're cutting off all of my tops. So I am going to flower underneath here where they can't see me. Ha, 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 ha. Right?
Every time.
Every time. Some ancient herbalists believed that basil damaged the internal organs and the eyes, and that basil caused insanity, coma, and the spontaneous generation of worms, lice, and scorpions. That's scary, isn't it?
Yes.
My goodness. As a matter of fact, there was a mythological beast called the basilisk. Have you ever heard of the basilisk?
I've not, no.
And the basilisk was this terrible, terrible demon. And it was like the personification of the fear of basil. Right? It took a long time before people were willing to calm down about basil. And the folklore continues. In some lands, the basil is said to be so evil that if you have it on your breath and you kiss someone, they can die. That certainly makes pesto eating a dangerous sport, doesn't it?
It does.
The ancient Greeks believed that basil would only grow if gardeners shouted and cursed while sowing the seed. Have you ever heard that?
No, I've not. That's interesting.
I was actually told that when I was, many years ago when I was first gardening, I was told this basil seed, you have to say bad words when you plant the basil seed because that's what makes the basil grow. I never did. I thought it was a rather odd aberration, but it's interesting to find that it goes so far back that it's not, just this one person that was telling me this, right? So basil, in fact, can be offensive. And not just because of the basilisk or kissing people and making them die from basil, but because especially throughout Arabic countries, basil is associated with the ability to alleviate menstrual cramps. And thus, if you were to offer an Arabic man basil in any form at all, you are basically insulting him and telling him he's a woman, right?
Okay.
That you're going to alleviate his menstrual cramps by giving him basil. Just the opposite may be true of basil. If you're a normal woman and you have a normal pregnancy, tucking into a big plate of pasta with basil pesto is not going to make you miscarry. But if you're a woman who does miscarry, if you've miscarried before, if you think that this pregnancy is like hanging by a thread, then don't eat basil pesto. Because there is, again, a pretty big block of folklore that says that basil can cause abortion. Now, I didn't mention last week when we were talking about peppermint, that peppermint is viewed with some of this same horror by a specific subset of healers called homeopaths. Have you ever been prescribed a homeopathic remedy?
I don't believe so, no.
Well, if you are, they will tell you that you cannot take that remedy within, it depends on the practitioner, I've heard, within an hour, within 2 hours, within 3 hours of consuming anything that has peppermint in it, or peppermint will completely nullify the homeopathic remedy.
That's interesting. I had no idea.
So no peppermint tea, no peppermint toothpaste, no after dinner mint, none of that, or your homeopathic remedy isn't going to work because mint and just the smell and the taste of mint is so strong that it will negate it. So there's also that kind of, are these things really safe? Well, yes, indeed. I thought this was a pretty funny story here. I planned a party in honor of a diplomat from the Kingdom of Jordan, and I flavored some spinach and feta pastries with fresh basil. The diplomat tasted the pastry, threw back his head, clutched his heart, and raved that he hadn't tasted anything so wonderful since his dear departed mother cooked for him. Of course, I was delighted, and I told him that the secret ingredient was fresh basil from my garden. The diplomat looked horrified and left immediately for the men's room where he stayed for a good half hour. While he was gone, one of the other guests clued me in. once I started to examine what was going on, I found a 17th century tale about a man in Italy who used dried basil as snuff. Now, that's an interesting way to use it, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, we could go back to the mint. Many people who experiment with smoking and don't have actual tobacco smoke what? Mint. It's a favorite smoke. It's not just menthol cigarettes, which, of course, the menthol comes from the mint, but the mint itself has been smoked. And so just one step further, powder the stuff, snuffle it up, and use it as a snuff. Oh, dear. He subsequently went insane and died, and an autopsy revealed that his brain was crawling with scorpions. It's sometimes hard not to laugh out loud, isn't it?
Yes.
Because being modern day people, we simply know that his brain was not crawling with scorpions. Basilis is the Greek word for king. And it's thought that Aristotle, a great student of herbs who had a garden of over 100 different herbs, probably named basil basilisk because he knew it from India, where it is considered the king of herbs. And that's Tulsi, of course, that we're talking about, holy basil, which is grown in India. In fact, in India, holy basil is the plant that is most important to Vishnu and Krishna. Varieties of basil can be found growing wild in Mexico, South America, Caribbean islands, and in Haiti. Fresh basil plants are the offering to Erzulie, who is the voodoo goddess of love. So, the author continues on, for all the fuss about basil and menstrual cramps, you would think that maybe basil would be really good to relieve menstrual cramps, but in fact, both scientists and women say, not really so good. Catnip is a whole lot better. People in Portugal chew on fresh basil plants to freshen their breath. In India, it is said that the uplifting aroma of basil can cause one to actually become enlightened. You know, I think I might have felt that smelling basil. Have you ever felt that way?
Have I what now?
Ever felt enlightened by smelling your basil?
Well, I don't know if I've been enlightened, but I've been delighted.
Right? You know, it is very, the smell of it is so truly uplifting.
Yes.
And in a way that's different, say, from the mint. The mint is like, you know, you smell the mint and you go, woo-hoo, yeah! You know? So it's that kind of, you know, so much so that we go, really? They've used peppermint for sleep, huh? All right. But the basil, it's just when I put my face in my basil bush and I inhale the smell, it's like something unwinds and relaxes in me.
Yes. Well, like when you're pinching it off, and I save all those like pinchings and just breathe them in so deeply. It's relaxing, and it's wonderful.
Yes, absolutely. And perhaps that's why pasta with a basil pesto is such a comfort food.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The smell of the basil, that relaxation, and then the carbohydrate of the pasta. Ah, how nice. A cup of fresh basil tea can be a wonderful toner for your face. Take fresh basil, put it in a sturdy mug, pound it lightly to bruise the leaves, and then pour some boiling water over it. Let it steep 20 or 30 minutes, and then either dip a cloth in it and wipe your face with that cloth, or put it in a spray bottle and spray it directly on your face. Don't dry it off. Just let it stay on your face, and then put whatever oil or moisturizer that you want on your skin. Someone just gave me a wonderful new oil, which I am so enjoying. It's rose hip seed oil.
Oh, that sounds nice.
It is so nice, and my skin is so loving it. So doesn't that sound wonderful? Some strong basil tea sprayed on the skin, and then some rose hip seed oil spread all over it. Ah, how beautiful we will look. In remote parts of Africa, basil tea is used as an after-shampoo hair rinse. It leaves the hair silky and the scalp smelling and feeling wonderful. Remember, way back in one of the very first of the mint family plants we talked about was rosemary. And rosemary is the mint that is considered top of the line for top of your head, for your hair and your scalp. But as we've been saying all along, virtually any mint can stand in for any other mint. So I think it's great to know that we can use basil to help with our complexion, because I wouldn't have thought about that. And because, as you say, because we are nipping off those little bits, there's often little bits of basil about. Of course, one of the really great things for the skin also is honey. And so I'm thinking this year that maybe when the basil is growing well, to put some basil leaves in a jar and pour honey over it, and then use that honey as a facial.
That sounds wonderful.
Yeah. I made basil and honey once before, but I was very disappointed in it because it didn't pick up much of the basil smell or aroma, unlike the mint honey, which smells so strongly of the mint. So I thought, well, basil honey, that's kind of doesn't really work. But now that I'm reading about how marvelous it is for the skin, I'm thinking maybe I will try that again. Now, you say that you grow several different kinds of basils. Tell us a little bit about some of those basils, if you would.
I grow typically a sweet basil, Genovese basil, and a spicy globe, because I like to use the Genovese for pesto, and then the other two just for whatever. I also grew a purple basil, and I cannot remember the name of it now.
It's usually just called purple basil.
Okay.
And it makes a really fabulous pesto.
It's a beautiful pesto, yes, and it's really interesting.
Yeah, and of course that dark purple color is anthocyanins, and those anthocyanins are very, very powerful antioxidants. So if you can get over the purple color of the purple basil for pesto, it is far more health promoting than the green. So you grow the regular sweet basil, which is one with the pretty big leaves.
Yes.
And then you grow a Genovese basil. Does that have smaller leaves?
I believe they are slightly smaller. They're not as big as the sweet
They're
basil.
not quite as big. And have you ever seen anybody who grew cinnamon basil or lemon basil?
I had lemon several years ago, and I've not grown it since. It was interesting, and I did make a pesto out of it, but I didn't love it as much as just the regular basil.
I agree with you, although the cinnamon basil is pretty interesting.
That would be interesting.
Yeah, because to me, basil is already a little bit on the cinnamon side. And then there's a basil called licorice basil.
Yes. Which
is also called Thai basil.
Yes, I've had Thai basil before as well.
And what do you think about that one?
I don't love the licorice flavor as much. It's okay, but it's cool to grow.
Yeah, it is. And again, we were saying thousands of different kinds of mints. Well, there's not thousands of different kinds of basils, but there's hundreds. And so once you start, actually getting into cultivating these, it becomes fascinating because you become part of this big human family of people who love plants that have interesting smells. and who work with these plants, which, as we've said before, are natural hybridizers. They love within their genus to say, hey, what would happen if we did this, or what would happen if we do that? And so you can just imagine, right, a basil plant and a lemon balm plant saying, hey, I wonder what would happen, and coming up with lemon basil, right?
Right.
Right. There's so much lore about sweet basil. The French have an idiom which is called semer la basilic, and it means to sow the basil, which actually means to rant and rave. And if that sounded like the basilisk, you're right. Remember that basilisk, the basil demon who rants and raves. And so when you sow the basil, you rant and rave. And so there is your idiom. Contemporary gardeners, however, know that you can grow basil successfully without any flamboyance when you are sowing it. The Italians call it Bacia Nicola, which means kiss me, Nicholas. And so basil is often used in courtship, or when you want to say to someone, I'm sweet on you. What do we call it? We call it sweet basil, right?
Yes.
So a sprig of basil given to someone means I am sweet on you. I'm courting you, right? I would like to know more about you and to get together with you. One of the reasons that some people start growing basil is because they're told it's a good companion plant for tomatoes.
Yes, we have done that.
Do you find that successful?
I've always just had a lot of success with basil, so they seem to love the tomatoes, but they seem to love everywhere in the garden as well. But we do grow them together.
Well, it's said that the basil will protect the onions, that the basil will protect the tomatoes against insects.
Okay.
And that may be so, but the truth of the matter is that I find that my tomatoes are not that bothered by insects. What they're really bothered by is wilts. And in really damp years, we just lose all of our tomatoes to, strange wilts and molds and fungi.
Right.
And the basil does not seem to protect it against that at all. I'm not blaming the basil. And I actually stopped planting my basil in with my tomatoes because I like to stake my tomatoes and plant them pretty close. And the basil really wants some sun.
Right.
And I was getting really scraggly basil trying to interplant it with the tomatoes.
Yeah, I experienced that as well.
The basil was saying, yeah. Would you stop listening to the book and listen to me? Get me out in the sun already. All right. Now, we talked about the mints, the mentha being true perennials. And they overwinter very nicely, even in really cold areas. Not so with basil, huh?
Yes.
Basil is, in a really warm climate, basil can be grown as a perennial, but most of us grow basil as an annual, and we even start the seeds inside or grow started plants because we want to get a pretty big basil plant, enough to get some pesto leaves off of it there before the cold sets in and the basil goes, oh, and drops all of its leaves. John Luss tells us that basil is an antispasmodic, an appetizer, a carminative, a galactagogue, and a stomachic. Basil is also an antibacterial, a breath freshener, and it clears the skin and is especially useful to help reduce nausea from chemotherapy. I thought that was a lovely indication for basil. John Lust recommends it for stomach cramps, vomiting, intestinal pain, constipation, whooping cough, and headache. And I could definitely see where sticking some basil on my head would probably make it feel better if it was aching. Basil is considered warming and drying. It is a diuretic and a diaphoretic, a nervine, an expectorant, and a stomachic. It is indicated when there is melancholy, irritability, and mental chatter that prevents one from sleeping. If there is poor vision, basil is recommended. Sinus congestion, chronic bronchitis, or chronic headaches, basil could be very helpful. If there is motion sickness or infestations with nematodes, basil is the mint that will help you there. Do you have rheumatism, arthritis? Do you convulse or have epilepsy? Basil has been thought to treat all of those conditions, as well as postmenopausal obesity. And again, that's one of those, my goodness, scorpions in the brain and postmenopausal obesity. You know. How terrifying.
Yes.
Basil can be used as a tea in the way that, we've been talking about using all of these mint family plants as a tea, but it is also tinctured. And I was thinking, maybe I'll make a little basil tincture. Like with the honey, I made some basil vinegar, and I was really unimpressed with it. The vinegar did not pick up the smell and the flavor of the basil. And when I really thought about it, I thought, that's why I'm sticking my face in the basil plant, because the smell is not that strong in the basil. Notice that nobody here is talking about basil essential oil. And so I wasn't surprised that I wasn't able to pick it up in honey or pick it up in vinegar. But I'm reading about it and thinking, wouldn't that be interesting then to try a basil tincture? Not because we wanted the smell of it, but because we wanted a more concentrated form. Herbalists have used basil tincture to relieve vomiting, to relieve digestive cramps, and after childbirth to help bring down the placenta. Again, we want to remember back to ground ivy, Glaucoma hederaceae, that very, very common little mint plant of fields and gardens. And that I was surprised to learn that midwives in some areas use a tincture of that to help bring down the placenta and to help prevent the retention of the placenta. And we're going to be talking about oregano and marjoram next week. And Italian midwives use oregano and marjoram in exactly the same way to ensure that the placenta is birthed. Now, remember, we started out at the beginning of this saying that even if you snuff up basil powder, you probably are not going to get scorpions in your brain, but that susceptible women have connected overconsumption of basil with premature labor or losing the baby. And so this comes back around here to the midwives using this tincture in more concentrated form. To do what? If we're saying that it ensures the birth of the placenta, then what we're saying is it ensures that there are indeed contractions of the uterus. And we recall then that statement where she said, well, I really put my foot in it, giving this Arabic gentleman, this man from Lebanon, some basil because it's supposed to be so good for menstrual cramps. But in fact, neither science nor women can actually confirm this. We would have to say that in this case, probably not. Probably the basil might even increase menstrual cramping because it does seem to have the ability to increase the contractions that are going on during and after birth, and that would be during menstruation as well. So here's to the basil and all that it brings us. I make a very simple pesto. I take basil leaves, no stalks, and put them in my little mini prep. And I put some fresh chopped garlic in, a little bit of salt, and then cover it in olive oil and turn on my machine and run it until it is all ground up to a paste, which is what pesto means. I then store this in a jar in the refrigerator with some oil on top, and I find that it keeps fresh and good and green and delicious for at least 2 years, or if I have a whole lot of it, I'll put it in the freezer where it's good for 10 years. I have gone over our time. I'm so sorry. Oh, I'm having such a good time, Gemini.
Oh, thank you, Susan. And that pesto recipe sounds wonderful, less complicated than mine. I'm going to have to do that because I didn't know it could hold that long either. So wonderful.
Well, it's the cheese and the nuts that make it go off.
Yeah, that's what I was just sitting here thinking. That's the two things I add. So I'll have to keep in mind when I do it next summer to do it your way.
It's easier and it keeps a lot longer. And hey, if you want cheese and nuts in it, you can always add those when you serve it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so
Okay.
much. That was interesting. And this concludes part 19 of our 24-part series, Marvelous Mints, The Wise Woman Way, with Susan Weed at Time Monk Radio.